Hi everyone, the time has come. The XCOM 2 Modlist is finally here. So, I actually just completed the campaign over on Twitch, and this Modlist is basically the result of that entire campaign. The way you can look at it is that my first Amalgamation campaign that I ran and finished just now, which is mid-October 2024 when I'm recording this, was pretty much a test run to check what works, what doesn't work, what needs to be changed for balance purposes, what needs to be changed in order not to crash, things like that. So this Modlist right here is basically the result of that entire campaign. I made significant changes between pretty much every single stream. At one point, like every new stream that I had daily, it had major, significant changes. Eventually, I stopped making major changes, but I kept making some minor tweaks pretty much all the way until the very end of the run, which was 20 streams total. So this Modlist right here is more refined and more balanced. Obviously, it's not going to be like super perfectly balanced because that's basically impossible with so many different mods from so many different authors. But I'm pretty happy with the current state of it. I'm actually very happy with the current state of it. So in this video, I wanted to go over some of the major mods that I use in it, and why I use them, what you can expect, etc. First, an important note, I am using the Beta Highlander 129, but you don't have to, you can use the current version, which is 128. The reason I use the Beta Highlander is because it fixes some of the crashes I run into, but you do have to pick one or the other. If you pick Beta, use the Beta Highlander and the Beta Alien Hunters Highlander. If you use normal, use 128 for both. So anyway, in case you're not familiar with Amalgamation, which is how classes work with this setup, it's basically a combination of 3 different specializations, each with their own separate row. That's pretty much how they work. So for example, your soldier could be, let's say, a sharpshooter, hotshot officer. And the sharpshooter has 1 row, hotshot has 1 row of abilities, and officer has 1 row of abilities, where sharpshooter allows you to use the sniper rifle, hotshot allows you to use a pistol, and the officer allows you to use a holotargeter. So in this case, you have to decide whether you want to use the pistol or the holotargeter as your secondary weapon. You can obviously switch them back and forth between missions, but when you pick abilities, if you pick abilities for the holotargeter, and then you send that person on a mission using a pistol, then obviously your holotargeter abilities will not be useful in any way, shape or form. And another thing about Amalgamation is that in normal XCOM, quote-unquote, you always have the same exact ability in that exact rank, so you know exactly what to expect. That's not quite how Amalgamation classes work. The way Amalgamation classes work is that you have a deck of abilities, a certain pool of abilities, and you can have some of them in certain ranks, but it's semi-random. You're not guaranteed to actually have any of them. The only one you are actually guaranteed 100% is the starting ability at Squaddy. Anything else is semi-randomized. So you can get, let's say, I don't know, precision shot on a sharpshooter at Lieutenant, but you might get it at some different rank, or you might not get it at all. So that's how they work. It will be slightly different every single time. It will not be the same every single time, even within the same specialization. And that means you have to adapt. You just have to adapt in general when using Amalgamation, because you can't just go for the exact combo that you want. Maybe if you're super extremely lucky to get that exact combo, but there will be hundreds, sometimes thousands of combinations, depending on how many Amalgamation mods someone is using. There are a lot of combinations. You are unlikely to see like the exact one you want, which means you have to adapt. Not to mention, even if you do get the exact one you generally want, you might not get the exact abilities that you want. So that's what I enjoy about it. It forces you to adapt, and it makes things quite a bit more fun, especially if you have like thousands of hours in XCOM 2 like I do. Now, it did take me a little bit of time to get used to it. There are a lot of abilities, there are a lot of specs, So it takes a little bit of time to memorize the important stuff, but once I did, it's a lot of fun. So that's Amalgamation. Now, there are quite a lot of Amalgamation specializations on the Steam Workshop. I picked, obviously, just some of them. But I'm pretty happy with the class balance that I currently have. I might still add or remove something over time, but likely nothing major. So next up, one of my favorite new additions that I added like maybe 1/3 for this campaign is actually Advent Not Created Equal. This is a great mod, it's been a lot of fun, and it's a very simple mod at its core. What it does is very simple at least. It just randomizes the stats of most the enemies, not every single one of them, and there are some plugins that make it work with some of the modern enemies, but it will randomize the stats of vast majority of the enemies. So by default, you can see right here what the default is. I made some small changes, so I added some randomization for will as well as hack defense, which are not randomized by default. And what this mod does, other than the obvious, is, one, it forces you to pay more attention to the exact stats of all the enemies you face, but also what it does is, it turns some enemies that would normally not be as much of a threat into a much bigger threat sometimes, because maybe they will get much higher aim, for example. Maybe you will run into a Viper with much higher aim, which means it's much more likely to pull somebody in and away from your group. And maybe towards even more enemies, maybe trigger another pod. And sometimes you will run into a normally threatening enemy who will have lowered stats, and maybe he will be a bit less threatening that time. I've been enjoying this mod a lot, even though at its core what it does is, like I said, very simple. But it's easily one of my favorite additions, and I will almost certainly be using regularly from now on. It's been a lot of fun to use it. So next up, I am also now using TES Loot Mode, and I did add this like maybe halfway through the campaign or so. It is a pretty powerful mod, you can get some very strong weapons and armor out of it, and I am using some extra mods along with it that rebalance it a little bit, and also they add even more upgrades. This can potentially give you some very strong items, like I said, and the way this works is that you basically get log boxes as you go, as loot, and then you have to open them. And you get a choice, usually between two types of items. Well, the third one is random, so you might get a choice of, let's say, an assault rifle and maybe a pistol. If you don't like either, you can just pick random. I did make some extra changes here, nothing major though. I turned off some items that are not being used in Amalgamation, and I turned off one item type that was not showing up at all. So it was basically just a dead item. If you picked it, you got nothing. So I turned that off to avoid that issue. But yeah, I went back and forth with this mod, whether it's too strong or not too strong. And with my current balance of the Modlist, what will likely happen, what can happen, is that you will start gaining a lot of power, like midway through the campaign in the mid-game, and you might start feeling really strong at one point. However, there are a lot of very challenging enemies in the late game, especially once you get past force level 16. So the way I see it, with the way my Modlist is balanced right now, the mid-game is there to prepare you for the late game. You need to be well prepared for what's coming at force level 16 and higher. A lot also obviously depends on the exact second wave options you play with. You could play with something like, I don't know, Grim Horizon, that makes dark events permanent, which will obviously make the whole thing much harder, but I think that's actually doable with my Modlist. I might even try that myself next, we'll see about that. At one point I was also using an extra mod that gives all these items a negative, but I decided to drop it because I didn't really see it as useful enough, because some of these negatives were actually really bad, so I ended up basically never using these items at all. And the negatives that weren't bad, I used up using in missions where they were either irrelevant, for example, they gave you fear of lost, so I used them in missions without any lost, which effectively made that downside non-existent. Or in other cases, they had a downside that wasn't really relevant on that soldier class. For example, a sniper rifle that occasionally made you hunker down after a move. If you move with your sharpshooter, you generally aren't going to shoot after that move anyway, unless you're using it on someone with snapshot. So that wasn't really super relevant either. So I decided to just remove the downsides. Those came from an extra mod, basically. I am also using an extra mod with some additional Tesla Loot Mode upgrades, and some of them are pretty powerful. However, I have a lot of really nasty enemies in the late game. A lot of the missions can be extremely challenging. I actually had to leave probably like a dozen missions over the course of this campaign because they were simply too hard. And they weren't like obligatory, they were optional, so it was better to just leave than risk a squad wipe. Either way, the point is, while Tesla Loot Mode is a pretty powerful mod that will increase your power level quite a bit, I think it's fairly balanced with the current state of this Modlist right now. I might still tweak things over time, but as of today, I'm reasonably happy with how it played out. Also, some of the armors that you can get with this setup will still have downsides, and some of them are actually quite fun. I enjoyed seeing some of them, and using some of them in practice. So next up, I cannot not mention the Requiem Legion mod. This has been like a major part of this campaign. And the Requiem Legion is an amazing mod, but it's definitely a mod for, I would say, XCOM connoisseurs. If you're like a beginner XCOM player or something like that, or you usually play maybe on lower difficulties, you might not enjoy this mod as much, because most of the enemies added by this mod are pretty rough. There are some extremely tough enemies in this mod. Let me put it this way. Up until this point, up until the current campaign that I just finished as I'm recording this, the most challenging enemy from any mods on the Steam Workshop that I ever fought was the Exalted Custodian Grandmaster, but that is no longer the case. There are several enemies in the endgame from Requiem that can be and are more challenging than that. So let me put it that way. You've been warned, alright? And also, this mod has several second wave options. One of them is actually hard mode, where you can make things even crazier. With that said, it also has the gentle Requiem option, which turns off the reactions, because vast majority, if not all of the Requiem enemies, will have a reaction mechanic where when they get hit by anything, they will react once. They will just get an extra action. They will not necessarily react to the person who shot them, they will just literally get an action. But that only happens once per turn. The Gentle Requiem option can disable that mechanic. And at the same time, there's also the hard mode, which is not mutually exclusive with Gentle Requiem, so turning off both is basically an alternate medium mode. That is likely what I will be playing next, actually. And there are also several other Requiem-themed mods. There's Gameplay Mutators mod, and I am using that. It's a pretty good one. It adds a bunch of C-trips. I actually turned off 2 of those for various reasons. I turned off Heavy Fog in my config because I had some issues with it. It doesn't always work properly. It applies to some Advent units, but not the others. So I wasn't able to play with the assumption that all of the Advent units will respect this, because some of them did not. So that's why I turned this off. And I also turned off shield deployment, because this was extremely obnoxious to play with. Very, very annoying. It applied to some units, like for example the Warlock zombies, that made it even more annoying, to be honest. And it wasn't necessarily that much harder. There are harder C-traps out there. It just made a mission take much, much longer. So that's why I turned it off in my config. That's all part of the campaign tweaks mod right here at the top. There's also Requim Armory, which adds some items you can get as a reward for killing various Requiem enemies. I actually wasn't using this. in my campaign because I didn't start with it, and this cannot be added midway through the campaign. You have to have it in your campaign when you originally started. You can't just add it midway through or things will break. There are also Praetorians, which are really dangerous enemies. There's a harder war advanced aliens as well. There are Ethereals. I am using Ethereals. Ethereals are, well, basically the Ethereal enemy from XCOM 1, maybe with some new stuff. They do some of the things the Ethereals from XCOM 1 do, but they also do some other things. It's a rare enemy that starts appearing at force level 16. So another mod I use is Cionic's X Minina, and this is quite a fun mod. I've been enjoying it. Now, to be fair, I didn't actually take advantage of this as much as I should have for various reasons. I was really struggling for supplies and resources for a large part of my campaign, and I just didn't spend as many resources as I should have on this. And the way Cionic's X Minina works is that you build the Cionics facility, as usual, experimental Psi, but it works a little bit differently. So you can use it to fabricate PCSs, and this mod introduces like a whole bunch of new PCSs that have various effects, but more notably, they give you a little bit of will increase, and they give you Psi offense increase, so they are meant as a way to improve Psi offense of that person. And you can send anyone from your roster, any soldier from your roster can be sent to Cionic grading. And they will get a grade ranging from like 1 to 5. And the higher, obviously, the better. And this grade basically tells you how good they will be at using psionics. And any soldier who has been graded will be able to equip the Psiamp. So then you can equip the Psiamp, and the way you get psionic powers with the Psiamp on just a regular normal soldier is by adding these attachments to the Psiamp. You can see some of them on the screenshot right here, for example. So that's basically how it works. You can add a bunch of attachments to the Psiamp, and some of them will actually add an extra slot, so they are freebies in that sense. You can end up with like 5 or 6 in one Psiamp. And then you equip that Psiamp on somebody who has been to Cionic grading, and then you can use the Cionic abilities that are basically attached to that specific Psiamp on that person. Now, using Cionic abilities on a normal soldier who has been Cionic graded will take will. So if you spam them too much, you will end up panicking or shattering much easier than you otherwise would have. Just something to keep in mind. But I've been enjoying this mod quite a lot. And one of the benefits of using this with Amalgamation is that if you get a specialization on some person where you maybe end up with no secondaries at all, which is possible, you can end up with no secondaries, or if you end up with just one secondary that you don't plan to use at all, like for example, I did have infantry class soldier who was also able to use swords, but the way his specialization was set up, ended up with me like never using any melee weapons with him because I had no need. That was not how he was built. So somebody like that could really benefit from Cionic grading, and then just use the Cionic amp instead of the sword that I never ended up using on that person to begin with. So there's some really good synergy between the two. But like I said, I've been enjoying this mod a lot. It's a great mod. And to that point, I am also using the actual Cionic class, which is Rusty Cionic. This is basically a whole separate Cionic class, and it plays nicely with Cionic's X Minina, which is why I'm using it. However, because this is a very strong class, it is very powerful, I'm now treating it as basically a 4th hero class. And the way I did that is by using Rescue Resistance Leader. So I am using Rescue Resistance Leader mod, which basically adds an operation here. It basically just adds a covert operation to Covert Infiltration, which is a 2-part chain. The second one is a mission where you have to rescue that person from a cell. It's just basically a VIP rescue mission. And you can configure this mod to use any class you want. By default, it uses a specific class and Jane Kelly, but I changed that in my config mod. And now I'm using Cionic's class for this. And I also disabled all the normal recruitment for the Cionic's class. You will not be able to obtain the Cionic class through normal means at all. The only way to obtain one with my setup will be through Rescue Resistance Leader. And you will only be able to get 2 of them. That's how I set it up. So if you have less than 2, you will be offered this chain at one point, and if you successfully do the rescue, you will get yourself a Cionic on your roster. That's basically how it's going to work with my setup now. I do like having them around. Now again, this mod has nothing to do with Sionic's Ex Machina. It's a completely separate mod. They just play nicely with each other. But I like having a specific Cionic class around. And I like the idea of them being a 4th hero class, hence my setup. Okay, so next up we have Soldier Conditioning. So this also plays into Amalgamation classes. And before we go into Soldier Conditioning, one of the options in the config for Amalgamation classes is whether you want to use the XCOM row or not. And originally, I started playing with the XCOM row enabled, but the issue I had with the XCOM row was that the abilities you get from the XCOM row are completely uncurated, which means that I ended up with a lot of completely useless ones, or even just straight up bricked abilities that didn't work with that specific specialization, with that specific soldier, and a handful of extremely overpowered ones. And I didn't like that because, well, it was just way too random, it didn't feel good, it wasn't something you could really plan around. So I changed that and I disabled the XCOM row entirely. There's no more XCOM row at all on anyone. And in exchange, I made a change in Soldier Conditioning. So the Soldier Conditioning mod, first of all, is basically a replacement for stat gains you can get from Covert Operations. I turned off the stat gains from Covert Operations. There's still like 1 or 2 that pop up here and there, I don't know why, but they are not supposed to be popping up. I use like a separate mod to disable all the stat rewards from Covert Operations. And in exchange, you can get a specific stat increase from Soldier Conditioning. Now this is done in the Training Center facility. You can send 1 soldier at a time. It takes some time to go through conditioning. They will be tired at the end of it, so that person will basically not be usable for a while, unless you decide to send them on a mission tired, which I usually don't do. You can do it, but yeah, they might end up shaken afterwards, etc. Anyway, the point is, this takes some time, and you can get 1 specific stat increased. So aim, HP, mobility, dodge, defense, will, hacking skill, that kind of thing. And once you're done with the training, you will get that stat increase, you will get some ability points, and you will get some abilities from that specific class's deck. So if you have, I don't know, sharpshooter, hotshot, and officer, you will get some abilities from these 3 specific specializations, the ones that you are missing. Because as I said earlier, the way Amalgamation works is that you don't get the same exact ability in the same exact rank, every single rank. So if you have a soldier who's a sharpshooter, hotshot officer, you're not going to get the same exact ability from sharpshooter at corporal, sergeant, lieutenant, and so on. They will be semi-randomized because there are pools of these abilities that go in specific rank ranges. So there are abilities that can be rolled anywhere between corporal and lieutenant, for example. That kind of thing. And there will be abilities from sharpshooter that you will not get at all on that one person, because they maybe weren't lucky enough to roll them. So then, if you are missing some key abilities, you send that person to Soldier Conditioning, and they will get some abilities from their specific deck that are not available through normal progression to that person. So you can get some of the abilities that are missing on that person through Soldier Conditioning. And this is a much better system than using the XCOM row, because you're guaranteed to get something that you can actually use. You might not like what you get, so you might be able to, let's say, use a pistol on that person, like in my example here, but you build them around the holo-targeter with the officer spec. So then you get maybe 2 different abilities for the pistol that you weren't planning to use, and they are not as useful for you. But this does introduce some interesting decisions. You can send the person to Soldier Conditioning at Sergeant rank, minimum, So this creates a question of whether to send them right away. Maybe send your good people as soon as you can. So maybe send your best spec soldiers as soon as you're able to, so that we can get the abilities from them and then plan their build better. Or maybe wait until later. And here's the important part. When you send somebody to train in soldier conditioning, the number of abilities they get will depend on their combat intelligence. And by default, there's some randomization in soldier conditioning. But I changed the settings of soldier conditioning through my tweaks mod quite significantly. So I changed the stat ranges that you get quite significantly. And I also changed the number of abilities you get depending on the combat intelligence. There's no randomization at all anymore. With my setup, you specifically get one ability at standard and above average combat intelligence. You're guaranteed to get one. You get 2 abilities at gifted and genius. You're guaranteed to get 2 abilities at gifted and genius. And you get 3 at savant. Getting a savant is very hard. It usually requires you to go through the improved combat intelligence covert operation. So what you can do is get maybe 1 or 2 of what you plan to be your best soldiers in the long run, to wait until they becomes a savant. So just wait until you get a certain number of covert operations that they can go through to increase their combat intelligence, get them all the way to savant, and then you can send them to do soldier conditioning and get 3 abilities. Because you can only do soldier conditioning on that person once per campaign. Once you've done it, you cannot do it again. If you increase their combat intelligence later, and maybe you want to do it again, you cannot do it again. You can only do it once and that's it. So this does introduce an interesting decision whether to do it as soon as possible, or maybe if somebody is basically right below gifted, for example, so above average, or maybe somebody is a genius, so right below savant, maybe you want to wait until they can go through the covert operation, improve their combat intelligence, and then do soldier conditioning. You get the idea. I quite like this setup now. It's quite fun. And sometimes, if you train someone late on, because you will not be able to train everyone early on due to the fact you can only train 1 person at a time, so maybe you end up training some of your good soldiers once they already made, let's say, captain, or maybe even higher, maybe even colonel, or major. And then you get 2 or 3 like extremely good abilities, but ones that would only work if you change their specialization. Maybe then you might want to respec them. An option like almost nobody ever uses, but you might want to consider it then. Anyway, so that's soldier conditioning. So another thing I'm using is a 5-tier weapon overhaul right here, which does exactly what it sounds like. It changes the weapon tiers from default 3, which is ballistic, magnetic, and plasma, to 5. And the default order is ballistic, then magnetic, then coil, then laser, then beam. I don't mind the default order. I didn't want to mess with it too much, so I left it at default. Now, the costs of these weapons with a single build, and the Covert Infiltration is based basically around a single build, are sometimes maybe a little bit off. There are reasons for the way they are set up, but there are some specific items with the setup I'm using right now that will be way more expensive than others, especially some of the secondaries. And I might eventually change this a bit, but for now, I left it as is. I don't mind the cost like too much, but just a heads up so you know. You might see some secondaries that will be significantly more expensive than the others. And the actual primary weapons will be relatively cheap. But do remember that this is with single build. So you have to build a separate weapon for like each soldier. And with Covert Infiltration, a lot of the time you will end up sending more than 1 squad to do something. You might be infiltrating a mission with 1 squad of 6 people, which will take, let's say, I don't know, 7 or 8 days. And then you get another mission while they're infiltrating, and you have to send another 6 people. So suddenly you need 12 weapons total for each soldier in both missions. So the costs can't be too high. And I've been struggling with supplies basically for this entire campaign. It's been a big problem. even with weapon costs being relatively low with this setup. Well, either way, I do enjoy the 5-tier weapon overhaul a lot, because I always felt like the gap between ballistic and magnetic, and then between magnetic and plasma is just too big. It takes too long to go from ballistic to magnetic, which creates a problem where even if you research magnetic relatively early, you can get into a situation where you start seeing much tougher enemies at higher force level, but you don't quite have magnetic weapons yet, and you really start to struggle at that point. So I wanted to avoid that problem, and with 5-tier weapon overhaul, the weapon progression is much smoother. So I've been enjoying playing with it a lot. And also, like single build as well as 5 tiers is something I enjoyed about Long War of the Chosen a lot, so I wanted to go back to that in some way, and I have. Alright, there are a few smaller mods I'm using, but ones that are fairly important. One of them is actually Lethal Ruler Rework. So what this does is add some anti-cheese mechanics to the rulers, so now they will react to any damage they take, including from like squad sight and out of line of sight, and they also get an extra action turn. However, you can set the map to not react to movement. And I had some problems with getting this to work originally, because they were still reacting to movement when I tested it the first few times. But as it turned out later, that was because there was one specific ability that made them react to movement. And I only happened to move people who had that one ability. Which is pretty crazy if you think about it. Out of like 40 people on my roster, I only had 3 with that one specific ability. And the first 3 times I tested it, I only ever moved people who had this ability. So I thought the movement part is not working at all. When in reality, later on, when I did more testing, I discovered that it was just 3 people who were causing it, and it was caused by one specific ability. So that's been fixed since then. It should work properly now with my setup. So with the tweaks mod and this mod, Lethal Ruler Rework, the rulers should not react to movement. So that gives you greater tactical flexibility. I like this kind of rework because it eliminates both extremes. The way rulers like usually work with vanilla mechanics is that you can cheese them to the point where there's basically zero risk involved whatsoever. On the other hand, if you get really surprised by, for example, the Berserker Queen and your entire squad is grouped up, you can't really spread out, because the moment you move one person, like she will move in and AoE stun everyone. So I don't really like them reacting to movement. It makes them feel like way too gimmicky, and it makes it so that certain abilities are literally a liability. Any ability that gives you an extra movement action, for example, is literally a liability against rulers. So I quite like this. But just a heads up, the rulers should not react to movement. Again, if you're using my tweaks mod, because if you're not, you have to actually go into the config files of the Lethal Ruler Rework and change it yourself. And by the way, without my tweaks mod, the certain mods on this list do not work properly out of the box. Most notably, 5-tier weapon overhaul does not work out of the box with single build, which Covert Infiltration uses. You have to actually go into the config files and change a few lines to make it work with a single build. I have taken care of all of that in my tweaks mod. If you use this Modlist and my campaign tweaks mod, which is meant to be used with this Modlist, it takes care of all of that. It takes care of all of the necessary setup in certain mods to make them work. So you don't have to change anything. It should work. So another mod I'm using, which I used in the past, but that was pretty long time ago, is the Mox initiative. And there's a mod that renames them to Exalt. Right here, this is the mod that renames them to Exalt. This doesn't really do anything other than just renames them. I just feel like this works better. But it's a purely like visual cosmetic change. So the Mox enemies themselves are actually quite challenging. The missions where you run into Mox can be pretty hard, but they provide some pretty decent rewards. And they provide quite a bit of extra variety and an additional threat. And I actually lost some soldiers during my campaign because of the Exalt/Mox encounters. I will let you discover everything they can do on your own. It does also add an extra dark event from time to time where they will make themselves stronger. You can counter it the usual way, but you will also sometimes get a covert operation to counter basically an exalt buffing themselves up and progressing. Either way, it adds an additional threat, and it's a quite dangerous threat. So another mod I'm using is actually the Flood, which replaces the Lost. I started using this like fairly late into my campaign, but I'm really enjoying this. This is a significantly more threatening version of the Lost. They have certain mechanics that can catch you off guard. I'm not going to spoil all of it, but if you want to know all of the details, you can just read what they do over here, and you will have all of the details. If you don't read it, you're in for at least some surprises. I do quite like this replacement. It works really well, and it makes them much more interesting, more threatening. I also turned off headshots, so I will likely be using this in all my campaigns for the foreseeable future. I really like this replacement. Another mod I'm using, which I quite like, is alternate bleed-out mechanics. And this basically makes it so that your chance to die instead of bleed out is based on will as the amount of overkill damage. Right here. So that's what this mod does. And this is enabled for second wave options, by the way. And speaking of second wave, if you use my tweaks mod, which again you should if you're using my Modlist, otherwise it will not work properly, and it will not be anywhere near the same thing, it will enable a bunch of second wave options by default. So you will have a bunch of them enabled. You can obviously just change them yourself. You can just go into second wave, enable some, disable some, enable some extra stuff, but it will enable a bunch of options that I play with by default, including alternate bleed-out mechanics. And I think that covers all the important stuff. Now, there are a lot of small changes I made, which I could talk about for the next 5 hours probably, but yeah, obviously I don't want to do that. I wanted to cover just the important stuff. From a few tweaks I made after the whole campaign was finished, is disabling some of the really overpowered items. So most notably, if you're using the Raider faction SCP Foundation, and I really enjoy this mod, it has like a very fitting flavor. It fits the XCOM universe really well in my opinion, and I just really like this mod, so I didn't want to disable it. But one of the items you can get as loot from this mod is a stun grenade. It's basically a grenade with a guaranteed stun, which is way too powerful. So I decided to just straight up disable it. I removed it from the loot tables and replaced it with Elerium cores. Because like I said, it's just way too powerful in my opinion. But I didn't want to just straight up remove the entire SCP mod, because I really enjoy this mod. And I am using a bunch of Raider factions, by the way, in case that wasn't obvious. I do like having them around, and they can create some interesting three-way fights between like you, Advent, and the Raider faction. Sometimes a four-way fight if there's also the Lost. And I originally used AI to AI activations in my campaign, but I ended up disabling that eventually because it created way too many problems. It became way too problematic later into the campaign, so I am not using it anymore. But obviously nothing stops you from using it. You can add it or remove it anytime you want. I am also now using, this is like after the campaign finished, I am now using Frost Munitions mod, which nerfs the Frost Grenade. It only makes it apply freeze at the epicenter, and then it applies like chill and bitter chill outside of that. However, it makes Frost Grenades much more easily available, because you can just make them with Create Experimental Grenade project. It also adds some immunities to various enemies, so I removed those immunities, because I think just nerfing the frost effect is enough. The reason I don't like the default version of the Frost Bomb is that you basically only ever get one Frost Bomb, it's the Frost Bomb, but it's way too powerful. So I don't like that kind of balance, where you get one like extremely overpowered item. If you lose that item, you're kind of screwed. If you have it on one squad, but then you have to do a different mission, like that second squad will be significantly less powerful. And I just don't like overall how powerful the Frost Bomb is, so I will be playing with this mod now, which again only makes it apply freeze in the epicenter unless you have a massive radius, like 5, 6 or 7, which is not easy to get. But up to radius 4, it will only work at one single tile in the epicenter. But yeah, like I said, I did remove the immunities, because I think it's a little bit too much to add Frost immunity to all robotic units, like Codex, Spectre, Andromedon, Gatekeeper, Viper. I think that's a bit too much, so I removed the immunities. Also, speaking of overpowered things, I did disable Nukes in my Tweaks mod, because one, they are just way too powerful, and they can also be a little bit buggy, but they are mostly just way too powerful, so I removed them outright. You will not see Nukes. And I think that basically covers all of the biggest mods and the important things. I might have missed something, and I made like a lot of changes, I made a lot of additions. I could probably talk about this for the next few hours, but that was not supposed to be the point of this video, obviously. One notable change that I did make, which is more of a personal preference, and it was something that's very hard to like balance, is ambushes. So I basically reduced the risk of ambush to a minimum. You will still see an ambush, you might still run into an ambush, but it will now be very easy, or much easier, to completely counter it if you send equipped soldiers to a mission with some ambush risk. And the reason I reduced the ambush risk to a minimum is because I use a lot of modded enemies on this list, and some of these modded enemies are included in encounter lists for ambush specifically when they are not supposed to be. The ambush missions are not supposed to include any enemies that can incapacitate you, because you're only using 2 soldiers a lot of the time. Sometimes you get 3, but a lot of ambushes will only involve 2 soldiers. So, for example, Vipers are not supposed to show up in ambush missions, because they can just pull you in, they can just immobilize you, and if they do that to both your soldiers, then you basically just automatically lost, because you have no way to free yourself. But there are a bunch of modded Vipers that will appear in ambushes. Some really tough ones too. And that's just one single example. There are enemies that can mind control you, that can appear in ambushes. So that's why, because ambush is such a tiny part of the game, like it's probably less than 1% of your campaign playtime, maybe even less than that, I don't particularly care about the ambush missions. For me, that part of the game might as well just not exist. I have plenty of difficulty elsewhere with this Modlist, so that's why I reduced the risk of ambush to a minimum, basically. So you should be able to mostly just avoid ambushes. It might still happen in some specific covert operations, but yeah, it will not happen much. Okay, and since we are on the topic of overpowered items, I am also using the Mimic Beacon Overhaul mod, which changes the Mimic Beacon into a Decoy Beacon. And the way the Decoy Beacon works is that it creates a 1 HP beacon, which can use cover, and it no longer has any special mechanics for the AI. So the AI will not drop everything they're doing to target the beacon. They will only target it if it makes sense to target it. You can see the changes outlined down here. So the special beacon targeting AI is completely disabled. The AI will just decide to shoot the beacon if it makes sense to shoot it. But it will only have 1 HP, however, the duration will be increased to 12 turns, and now it can use cover. This is a much more interesting version of the beacon, and a way less overpowered one. So I quite like that. I'm also using the morale system mod, because in some very, very long missions, you can end up losing a lot of will, which can be a problem, and with this kind of setup, some missions can be extremely long. So with the morale system, you have a chance to regain a little bit of will when you kill enemies. This is not a guarantee, and it's only like a small amount, so this is not like a huge impact, but I find it to be helpful, especially in some extremely long missions. I am also using a mod that will show you when you're losing will. That doesn't mean you're now losing will when otherwise you wouldn't have lost it. It just means that you were previously losing will, but you weren't aware of it. So now you will be aware of it because there will be a notification. Anyway, I think that's going to be it for this video. I'm sure that once I'm done recording this video, I'll remember about a few more mods I wanted to mention. That's probably going to happen. But I did cover all of the really important ones, I think. So, like I said at the start, I am overall quite happy with how the balance of this Modlist worked out right now. I will be playing it more. Maybe with some different settings. Well, not maybe. Definitely with some different settings. Maybe I'll try Grim Horizon. I did include Grim Horizon Fix on this Modlist. I wasn't using Grim Horizon in my first Amalgamation campaign, but I might actually give it a shot at some point and see how far I can get. And just a reminder, something I already said earlier, the late game, the end game with this Modlist will be very, very challenging. There are some very tough enemies in the late game, so it might feel like you are getting very strong, sometimes around mid-game, but treat that as a preparation for what's coming after Force level 16. Trust me, there will definitely be some extremely challenging missions with this setup. Although obviously it also depends on the exact second wave setup that you're using. Either way, that's going to be the end of this video. You can find the link to this Modlist in the comments below. So I do hope you will enjoy it, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.